Real story of Harshad Mehta. In the bustling world of Indian finance during the late 1880s and early 1990s, one name became larger than life: Harshad Mehta. Known as the Big Bull of Dalal Street, Mehta wasn't just a stockbroker, he was a phenomenon. But behind his dazzling rise and larger-than-life persona lies a story filled with ambition, deception, and an extraordinary scandal that would shake India to its core. Imagine a man who started from humble beginnings, selling hosiery in Mumbai, dreaming of making it big. Harshad Mehta's charm and sharp mind brought him into the world of the stock market, where he quickly carved a niche for himself. Using his unmatched confidence in a series of calculated moves, he became a symbol of hope for millions of Indians who saw the stock market as their ticket to prosperity. Mehta's meteoric rise wasn't just about his financial acumen. It was about the persona he cultivated, a man who turned stocks into gold and lived life king-size. But here's the twist. Behind the lavish lifestyle, designer suits, and imported cars was a web of manipulations that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Harshad wasn't just playing the stock market. He was playing the system itself. Using loopholes in banking and finance regulations, he orchestrated one of the most audacious scams in India's history, funneling crores of rupees into his stock market empire. At the peak of his success, Mehta was seen as an icon, celebrated by investors and adored by the media. But as the saying goes, what goes up must come down. When journalist Sucheta Dalal began investigating discrepancies in the banking system, the first threads of Harshad's intricate scheme began to unravel. The world that once celebrated him started to question everything. Was he a financial genius or a master manipulator? As we dive into this incredible saga, we'll uncover the truth about Harshad Mehta's rise, the cracks that led to his downfall, and how his story changed India's financial landscape forever. Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning of a gripping tale that will leave you questioning the very foundation of trust and power in the world of finance. To truly understand Harshad Mehta's story, we need to step back into the world he operated in. A world where the stock market was seen as a mysterious playground for the bold and ambitious. In the 1980s, India was undergoing massive economic changes, yet its financial systems were still rigid and full of loopholes. The banks operated in silos, the stock exchange was chaotic, and few people understood the technicalities of how money flowed behind the scenes. Harshad, with his sharp mind and unrelenting determination, found opportunities where others saw walls. He didn't just trade stocks, he studied them. He would spend hours analyzing patterns, reading between the lines, and figuring out what made the market tick. His efforts paid off as he began making consistent profits, and soon he wasn't just another stockbroker, he was the stockbroker. People trusted his instincts, and his charisma turned him into a star. But Harshad wasn't satisfied with being just successful, he wanted to be unforgettable. That's when he discovered the loopholes in India's banking system. At the time, banks were required to maintain a certain amount of money in government bonds. Harshad found a way to exploit this system by using what's known as ready-forward deals, a form of short-term borrowing where bonds were used as collateral. Through a series of carefully orchestrated transactions, he managed to siphon funds from banks without raising immediate suspicion. This money was then pumped into the stock market, driving up prices of select shares and creating a bull run that seemed unstoppable. Harshad's genius wasn't just in finding these gaps. It was in how he made it all look legitimate. He built a reputation as a financial wizard, someone who could turn the most stagnant stock into gold. Investors trusted him blindly, and the media painted him as a hero. His success became a national obsession, and ordinary people started pouring their life savings into the market, hoping to ride the wave he created. But the cracks were starting to show. The astronomical rise in stock prices wasn't sustainable, and behind closed doors, questions were being raised. How was Harshad able to command such massive sums of money? Why were certain stocks behaving so erratically? And why were some banks reporting unusual activities in their ledgers? Unbeknownst to Harshad, a storm was brewing, one that would soon turn his dream empire into a nightmare. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this gripping tale. As Harshad Mehta's empire grew, so did his confidence. He began living a life that most could only dream of, lavish parties, expensive cars, and a sprawling penthouse in South Mumbai that overlooked the city he had conquered. To the public, he was the very definition of success, a man who had beaten the odds and risen to the top through sheer brilliance. But behind the scenes, the mechanics of his grand operation were growing increasingly fragile. One of the key elements of Harshad's strategy was trust. Banks trusted him with their money, investors trusted him with their savings, and brokers trusted his tips to make their own fortunes. But trust is a double-edged sword, especially when it's built on shaky ground. As the amounts involved in his schemes grew larger, so did the risk. Harshad wasn't just moving money anymore, he was moving mountains, and every transaction carried the potential to bring his entire empire crashing down. Meanwhile, journalists and regulators were beginning to sense that something wasn't adding up. Sucheta Dalal, a sharp and persistent financial journalist, was one of the first to notice discrepancies in the way certain banks were operating. Rumors began swirling about massive sums being routed through unconventional channels, and Harshad's name kept surfacing in these whispers. Sucheta, known for her tenacity, started digging deeper, following a trail of anomalies that seemed to lead straight to the big bull. At the same time, tensions were brewing in the financial world. Harshad had made enemies in powerful places, people who envied his rise or felt threatened by his influence. Some brokers resented his dominance over Dalal Street, while certain bankers feared exposure if his operations were uncovered. Behind the scenes, alliances were forming against him, though Harshad seemed unfazed. His confidence in his own brilliance blinded him to the growing dangers. Investors, too, were beginning to feel uneasy. The stock market's relentless climb, fueled by Harshad's maneuvers, was starting to falter. Stocks that had soared to unimaginable heights began to wobble, and whispers of a potential crash rippled through trading floors. But Harshad remained defiant, assuring everyone that the market was solid and that his strategies were foolproof. Little did he know, the walls were closing in. As journalists uncovered more pieces of the puzzle and regulators began their inquiries, Harshad's carefully crafted empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. The question wasn't if it would fall, it was when. Stay tuned as the story plunges deeper into the unraveling of one of India's most audacious financial scandals. As the cracks in Harshad Mehta's empire widened, the tension became palpable. The very system he had exploited so brilliantly was now turning against him. Regulators who had once been oblivious to his methods were beginning to wake up, and the financial world was buzzing with speculation. Yet Harshad seemed calm, almost invincible, still basking in his carefully constructed image as the big bull of Dalal Street. But the pressure was mounting. Journalists like Sucheta Dalal were relentlessly pursuing leads, uncovering details that pointed to a scandal of unprecedented proportions. Each revelation added a new layer of intrigue, exposing how Harshad had used banking loopholes to funnel enormous sums into the stock market. The scale of his operations was staggering, involving multiple banks, brokers, and investors, all unknowingly entangled in his scheme. The deeper Sucheta and her team dug, the more the puzzle pieces began to fit together. Behind closed doors, the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, was starting to ask tough questions. How were banks showing massive losses where there should have been none? Why were certain stocks inexplicably rising, even when the fundamentals didn't justify their prices? Harshad's house of cards was beginning to sway, but he refused to acknowledge the storm brewing around him. Instead, he doubled down, projecting an air of confidence that reassured some, but raised doubts in others. Meanwhile, whispers about his lavish lifestyle began to draw public scrutiny. The man who had once been celebrated for his brilliance was now being questioned for his excesses. How could one stockbroker amass such unimaginable wealth in such a short time? The media, once his greatest ally, began to turn on him, painting him as a symbol of unchecked greed and corruption. But the real tipping point came when one of the banks Harshad had used as part of his scheme decided to speak out. This revelation sent shockwaves through the financial world, triggering a domino effect that Harshad could no longer control. Regulators launched formal investigations, raids were conducted, and the once unshakable Harshad Mehta was suddenly on the defensive. The stock market, driven to artificial heights by Harshad's manipulations, began to spiral. Panic set in among investors, who scrambled to pull out their money. It was chaos on Dalal Street, and all eyes were on Harshad. Would he emerge unscathed, or was this the beginning of the end? Stay with us as we inch closer to the explosive climax of this gripping story. The frenzy around Harshad Mehta was reaching its peak. As the investigations grew deeper, the walls around him began to close in. Regulators, government officials, and financial institutions were all on high alert, piecing together the elaborate puzzle of his operations. Yet even with the pressure mounting, Harshad maintained an air of defiance. He still believed in his ability to outwit the system, to find one more loophole, one last escape route. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Dalal Street was in chaos. Investors who had once trusted Harshad with their life savings were now desperate to pull out. The same brokers who had sung his praises were now avoiding his calls, fearing their own connections to the scandal might surface. The media hounded him relentlessly, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions every time he stepped out of his lavish apartment. Harshad, the once celebrated financial wizard, was now a man under siege. Inside the corridors of power, meetings stretched late into the night. Bank executives, government officials, and RBI representatives were scrambling to contain the fallout. Every new discovery added to the tension. A missing fund here, a fraudulent transaction there. The numbers didn't just expose Harshad's misdeeds, they hinted at the systemic flaws in the financial structure itself. For some, this wasn't just about Harshad Mehta anymore. It was about saving an entire system on the verge of collapse. At the heart of it all was Sucheta Dalal, who continued to peel back the layers of the scandal. Her reports were now making national headlines, each revelation more damning than the last. The public, initially stunned, was now outraged. How could one man manipulate such vast sums of money without anyone noticing? People were losing faith not only in Harshad, but in the very institutions meant to protect them. Despite everything, Harshad didn't give up. In interviews, he defended his actions, claiming he was simply smarter than the system and had done nothing illegal. His charm and confidence still convinced some, but for most, the cracks in his story were impossible to ignore. The weight of evidence against him was growing, and the markets were on the brink of collapse. As investigators closed in and the nation waited for answers, Harshad's empire teetered on the edge of ruin. What would happen next was anyone's guess. But one thing was clear. The climax of this story would leave an indelible mark on India's history. Stay tuned for the gripping conclusion. The day Harshad Mehta's empire finally crumbled was one of chaos and disbelief. As regulators stormed his offices and seized files, the full scale of his scheme came to light. The trail of evidence was undeniable. Fraudulent transactions, forged documents, and the illegal siphoning of funds from some of the country's biggest banks. The numbers were staggering, the damage irreparable. What had seemed like genius was now exposed as manipulation, and Harshad was at the center of it all. Dalal Street was unrecognizable. The stock market, once a symbol of Harshad's unrelenting rise, had collapsed under the weight of his scandal. Shares that had soared to dizzying heights plunged, wiping out the savings of countless investors. Panic gripped the financial world as banks scrambled to recover their losses, and ordinary people struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. Harshad's name, once synonymous with success, was now a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. When Harshad was finally arrested, it was a media spectacle unlike anything India had seen before. Cameras captured him being escorted by authorities, still dressed in his signature crisp white shirt and carrying his trademark briefcase. To some, he looked like a man unfairly targeted. To others, he was the villain who had shattered their dreams. Harshad maintained his innocence, claiming he had only used the system to his advantage and that he had never intended to harm anyone. The courtroom battles that followed were intense. Harshad's legal team argued that he was being made a scapegoat, while prosecutors presented evidence that left little room for doubt. Witnesses came forward, including former associates and banking officials, revealing the intricate details of his operations. The man who once controlled billions was now fighting to prove his worth in front of a judge. Just as the case seemed to reach its conclusion, an unexpected twist emerged. A series of documents hinted at deeper involvement from other powerful entities. names that had so far escaped scrutiny. It became clear that Harshad wasn't the only player in this grand game. While he bore the brunt of the fallout, questions lingered about the role of others who might have enabled his rise. In the end, Harshad Mehta's story became more than just a scandal. It was a reckoning for the entire financial system. His fall reshaped regulations and exposed vulnerabilities, leaving a legacy of lessons that India would never forget. But one question still haunts the story. Was Harshad Mehta a mastermind, or just the face of a much larger conspiracy? In the aftermath of Harshad Mehta's downfall, the world he had built so carefully lay in ruins. Dalal Street was scarred, and the Indian financial system faced a crisis of trust. For months, the scandal dominated headlines, and Harshad, once hailed as the Big Bull, became a symbol of unchecked ambition and the dangers of greed. His arrest, trials, and eventual conviction sent shockwaves through the nation, but they also sparked deeper conversations about the need for stricter regulations and greater transparency in the financial sector. For the ordinary people who had invested their savings, the impact was devastating. Families struggled to recover from the financial losses, and their faith in the stock market was shaken. But the story didn't end with despair. Over time, reforms were introduced to tighten loopholes in the banking system and bring more accountability to financial institutions. The stock market, though wounded, began to heal, offering a chance for a more robust and fair system to emerge. Harshad Mehta's legacy remains complex. Some see him as a cautionary tale, a man who flew too close to the sun and paid the price. Others argue that he was a product of a flawed system, someone who simply exploited opportunities that existed long before he came along. Even today, his story sparks debate about whether he was a villain, a victim, or something in between. In his later years, Harshad continued to maintain his innocence, insisting that his actions had been misunderstood. But his health deteriorated under the weight of the legal battles and public scrutiny. In 2001, Harshad Mehta passed away, leaving behind a legacy that would forever be etched in India's history. His death marked the end of an era, but the lessons of his rise and fall remain relevant to this day. For those who lived through the scandal, it's a story of shattered trust and hard-learned lessons. For future generations, it's a reminder of how ambition, when left unchecked, can lead to ruin. But perhaps the most enduring takeaway is the need for vigilance, not just in finance, but in every system that holds power over people's lives. Harshad Mehta's story is more than just a tale of scandal. It's a mirror reflecting the complexities of human ambition, greed, and the pursuit of greatness. And while his empire may have crumbled, his story continues to captivate, serving as both a warning and a legacy for all who dare to dream big.